Um, Hello, James. How are you today?
I'm good, Jenny. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for joining me here, and it's lovely to meet you in person, or rather, digitally in person. Where are you calling in from?
Well, I'm in the South Downs, in just between London and Brighton, in a little town near Haywards Heath,
Lovely,
in the
lovely.
southeast.
Um, and I have asked you to join me today because a few months ago I came across on X the Pendragon Foundation, and you are a member. Is that correct?
That's right. I work on the videos. So, for example, on
Yes.
YouTube, I made the recent video about Pevensey Castle. So
Yes.
that's what
Yes,
I
and we'll
work on
definitely
with
talk about
Pendragon.
that in a moment. But first, can you tell me what the Pendragon Foundation does and how it came about?
So the Pendragon Foundation came out of a need that we all see in the status where we are in 2025 for a restoration of castles to bring them with us together into our futures, not as dead, cold tourist attractions that we go to and we visit them on a occasional weekend like a little bubble of our history, but as places that are alive and can be brought into our futures and used to become centres of commerce, community, education, all sorts of things, depending on where the castle is, what our needs are. So we see this as something absolutely necessary as we see things like, for example, the our current custodians of castles coming into all sorts of problems with their membership numbers and just people. For example, there was just a report only recently of vandalism
Hmm.
on these sites on the rise. So we see this as a response to a definite need from castles. Otherwise, who knows what might happen?
And are these all English castles, or do you also have Welsh and Scottish and Northern Irish castles?
Yeah, we're looking to restore our castles all over our isles, from Scotland, from John O'Groats, all the way down to the south in Land's End, everywhere in between.
Wonderful. There's a beautiful castle not too far from me. I live in Belfast, and I'm only about a 10-minute drive away from Carrickfergus, which, as you may know, has a very, very well preserved Norman castle right on the shores of Belfast Lough, like hard on the water. Have you ever been?
No, I haven't. I'd love to go though.
Well, it's actually worth a visit. If you're a castle buff, which it sounds like you are, it's actually worth an entire visit just in and of itself because I mean, it's not massive, but it's not particularly small either, and it's perfectly preserved. It's that they have done it up very nicely. I have to say, I don't know if it's a National Trust property or who runs it, but I took my son there when he was little, and it was great fun because you can put on the metal helmets, like they're like buckets, like bins, like
Mm.
waste paper bins that you can turn up down over your head, and you can hold onto a big sword. And they have like the murder hole and whatever. So it's actually a very fun place to explore, especially if you have a young boy child. Um,
Yeah.
but more seriously, the reason I was so charmed by the idea when I saw your sort of inaugural tweet is that I find like I have a very sort of natural and immediate emotional connection to old places and old sites, and they just seem to me monumentally important. Um, Not just to the culture, which yes, they are absolutely important to the culture generally, in that we must know our own histories, but also just on a personal level. When you're walking around someplace in the outdoors, and you're in an environment where you're looking around, you're like, this has been with us, or this has been here for hundreds, maybe 1,000 years. And I think that genuinely does something to your psyche and your heart and your soul. And I'm not being hyperbolic. That is both soothing and it's reassuring and it's very interesting. And even if you're not from a that particular place, if you're not from that land itself, it's just a really important perspective. It's good for one's mental health, if nothing else. So That's why I was so happy to see it. Now, why this year? What made 2025 the year that you guys wanted to start this foundation?
Well, I think I touched upon it a little bit earlier, but the current most of the custodians of our castle, like our castles, like English Heritage and such foundations, are in trouble. They're in financial trouble, and
Hmm.
we see that a lot of these castles, despite their great potential, are not living up to them. Um, and that tourist model, that idea of a castle as a place where you just go to, and then you go there like in a little bubble, you have your little
Mm-hmm.
moment of, like you say, that feeling of connection, but then you just go back to your normal life.
Mm-hmm.
We see that model as dying and not being able to survive the test of time. And perhaps it served its purpose. Because back in, for example, I didn't know this before I looked into it, castles have been through relative periods of trouble before. For example, in the
Sure.
late 1900s, when their sort of military use had passed, and perhaps they weren't, with cannons and things like that, perhaps they weren't centres of military use like they were before. They were also left to rot in the rain. And for example, Hurstman Zoo Castle was found in the late 1700s with local people just using the bricks to build their own mansions and just taking
Right.
it apart. So we've had
Is this
periods
sorry? Was
like
this in
this
the late
before.
1800s?
Well, a broad period from around the 1600s to the 1800s, when
Okay.
perhaps they weren't centres of military anymore. They hadn't
Right.
quite found their purpose for tourism either. So
Right.
people were still perhaps living in them, but they started to become unaffordable and cold. So
Mm-hmm.
families, for example, who had inherited them, didn't want to live in them anymore. They wanted
Right.
comfort. That was specifically what happened with Hurstman Zoo Castle. That
Mm-hmm.
was left to rot and it was taken apart. But it found again the purpose in the late 1800s, where it's restored, and now it's presently a part of a college, Queen's University in Canada. So it's not like our
Yeah.
castles haven't faced these times before. We're just
Sure.
facing another wave of it where we need to rediscover them once more.
Sure. Yeah. Talk to me a bit about that. Because I take your point about the tourist bubble, and I think in general, tourism, at least on a massive scale, is actually probably a net negative for communities. Um, but one of the interesting things about the foundation is that you are trying to restore them as sort of living centers of community. Can you talk to me a bit about that? Like, can you give me an example of how you would envision the ideal usage for a castle in 2020 in the 2020s?
Well, we've got lots of ideas in our team. Um, Things like focusing on them as places to learn the skills of the traditional crafts, centres of celebration of medieval jousting, things like that. There are many other examples, but one specific example that I touched upon in my video um, was to bring them together into our future as places of education, of places where people can go to and study, not in grey, dull, concrete brick
Yeah,
buildings and glass, but in beautiful surroundings steeped in history. There's a reason why people are still drawn to Oxford or Cambridge, even if they were to decrease in the rankings and prestige. It's because of those beautiful. One of the reasons is because of those beautiful buildings that people study in.
yeah,
There's nothing like being inspired by your surroundings, and something
absolutely.
like a university or an education centre, training colleges, all sorts of things could be brought into our futures with castles, especially given that these castles often have massive pieces of land with them. We also talk about the need of being independent and being able to look after ourselves as a nation. Why not use these massive baileys for farming, for example?
Hmm.
Most of them are left just completely empty.
Yeah.
And
Tell me
even
again what the Bailey is, because
oh,
I've
so
definitely heard it before, but I always forget. What's the Mott and what's the Bailey?
I think I might have said it wrong there. I meant the outer Bailey. So the Bailey is
Okay.
the like the usually the keep, and then usually have the moat. It's just old
Mm-hmm.
English way of saying it, and then more often than not in the British Isles, our castles evolved over time. First with the outer walls built by the Romans, in most cases, and then Anglo-Saxons came in and sort of thought, well, how can we use these? So they would uh, post their their soldiers in there to protect the shoreline, the Saxon southern shore. And then the same thing with the Normans, but they came in and added their keeps, their stone keeps that silhouette that we all know, with
Yeah.
the huge square stone
Yeah.
keep like at the Tower of London. That came with the Normans. So the Bailey is the central part, the part they would fall back on. If you think of, for example, the two towers in Lord of the Rings, that's the part when they fall back to the central tower, um,
Mm-hmm.
after giving up the outer walls.
Right. Right. What's the difference between a castle and a palace?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, I I often think about it myself. I think
Oh, do you?
the center, yeah, yeah. For example, a lot of French chateaus pass as
Yeah.
castles, don't they? But they're not. They're not really. They have to be. They have to serve some kind of defensive purpose,
Ah,
some sort of
very interesting.
military connection.
Okay.
But of course, there are exceptions to the rule. For example, I mentioned earlier Herstmonceux Castle. Um, that was built with great, beautiful gardens on the outside of it, and in brick as well. And that wasn't something that was possible before the cannon, because it would be, well, there's no point in building a castle that's not
Right.
just for military purposes. So the difference between a castle and a palace, I suppose, is the defensive purpose. You can't defend a palace.
Right. Yeah.
It's purely
So I
a for
suppose,
show piece.
yeah, we're palaces then from the sort of less warlike age, the more genteel sort of late, sorry, I would say 18th, 17th and 18th century, when the sort of the era of the knights was over and we had nation states and borders that we that kept us sort of defended. Would that be
I
accurate?
suppose, yeah, I suppose so, Jenny. It's a combination of many things. It's a military factors, the cannon making a castle not useless, but less useful, perhaps,
Yeah.
when cannons can so easily break the walls. One must rely more on in an ability to defend an entire piece of land rather than an entire castle. So I suppose it's a confluence of factors. And I suppose in a way we kid ourselves that we're in the more genteel age, don't we?
Well, yes. Yes. Fair point. I
Mm,
would agree with that. Yeah, if anything, we're in something of a barbaric age. It's just that we
mm.
have indoor plumbing and we don't flay people or burn them at the stake anymore. So we think we're somehow evolved, and that would probably be a mistake. But so wait, tell me. So what? Tell me, is there a particular castle with a particularly let's, I don't know, say sort of gruesome history? Because when I think of when you mention the military aspect, I think of sieges, and were, if you know, the point of the castle walls, the fortifications were to keep out the enemy, but then people would also have been trapped inside. No, so are there any particularly sort of heroic or even grim stories from a particular castle that stand out?
Perhaps one that springs to mind, perhaps is neither grim nor nor heroic, but yet springs to mind is, I've looked into recently Southsea Castle in Portsmouth,
Mm-hmm.
and that was built as a star fort. So one of these sort of
Ah,
European type forts with cross fire built in mind. So the castle was built in a sort of star shape rather than a square, so cannons could cover every single angle from which it could be attacked. Now, this castle is an exception to the rule in that it was actually never taken. More
okay.
that the royalist guard and the leader there, apparently, when the parliamentarians attacked it, was too drunk to wield his soldiers, and in the end, Cromwell's soldiers just went over the walls. So, in some ways, castles haven't really outlived their purpose. It's just that we don't quite know how to use them.
Hmm.
Of course, when we talk about gruesome, the Tower of London springs to mind, and
Hmm.
its oft-said legends of the princes in the towers and things like that. And yet, at the same time, as us having this gruesome and heroic image of castles, that's true. And what I'd like to add to that is they're also places of safety. If
Yeah.
we think back to the Anglo-Saxon age and the Viking raids, being near one of those castles would have been a sign from the heavens. It's the Vikings
Yeah.
are under attack. We go to the hill. We go to the one of King Alfred's forts, and we'll be safe there.
Right.
Just the idea of
Right.
that castle being a place of safety is one
Yeah.
that perhaps appeals to many nowadays when we think about where we are in our civilization.
Yeah.
These castles are coming to attract more people out of that sense of safety as well. And that's
Yeah.
certainly something that you mentioned earlier, having been to castles with your little ones. And I appreciated castles as a child. I remember vividly going to Arundel Castle as a child and scrawling on the guidebook for the next few months all over it,
Hmm.
covering all the pages with my sketches. I wish I could find that now. But since becoming a parent too, and going back to these castles, that makes me realise that these places, we're drawn to them now, not just because of their heroic and romantic ideals, but also because they're places of safety which
Yeah.
connect us with our past.
Well, I'm not sure if you would agree with me, or maybe you would think I was overstating it, but there is a sense in the UK, I think, that the UK is somewhat under siege, and I would say personally that the forces laying siege to it are its own elites and its own government. Um, but there's a sense of a lot of turmoil, not just under the surface, but a bit like an iceberg. You can see the tip, but there's a lot more underneath, and a sense of certainly a lack of safety, and a sense of these violent attacks that are deeply uncharacteristic of modern Britain and Ireland, I might add. Um, and I think that it's a really interesting almost metaphor that you guys in net now, and I would imagine that, like everyone else, foundations like you mentioned, English heritage, all of these places are under enormous pressure because the state really can no longer keep up with its own weight. It can't carry its own weight anymore, so we're all under pressure and expecting to pick up more of the burden. Land is more expensive, everything is more expensive. And so this idea is sort of, I think, possibly catching fire a little bit within England. Certainly within England. I don't know about Scotland and Wales and the south of Ireland. The Republic of Ireland, it's a different bit of a different story, and Northern Ireland's a very different story again, because in a way that never really left here. But a sense of Englishness and a sense of suddenly feeling like, wait, what's happening here? We need to reclaim some of our heritage and be proud of that heritage. And I'm not English. I'm not an English person. I was born in Dublin, so I can't make any claim to even being a Brit at all. Although actually, technically, I could, because my father was from Belfast, so I could actually become a British subject if I chose. But the sense that you know I've been saying this now for the better part of a year. I go to England a lot to take part in events and stuff like that, and always find, and it's always sort of among these sort of like dissident, free speech, alt right, whatever you want to call us, and they're so they're such a dynamic group of people, an ideologically, politically, socially diverse group of people, and they made me appreciate England in a way that I never had before, which is basically sort of the source code for Western, not, I mean, for certainly the Anglosphere, and in a large degree Western civilization. I think Italy and England are the two cornerstones, and I suppose Greece as well. I've actually never been to Greece, but these places are cornerstones for everything that we now take for granted. That is so slowly being chipped away at, including law, obviously, the language that we all use. The and the language is so particular as well, and it's so deliciously varied, and I just feel like England needs to be protected. It is a crown jewel, and that was what really made me want to talk to you guys, because first of all, I also really appreciate anything that's sort of like a grassroots effort. I always feel extremely heartened by that when I see people just off their own bats, regular people, as we call ourselves, um, getting together and working on behalf of an ideal without getting permission first. I always think that's a very, very healthy sign. Can you tell me a little bit about your own background and how you came to be such an appreciator of castles?
Whoa, how far do we go back? It goes back to my childhood, and I had one visit to Arundel Castle. I must have been about 9 back then, and as a boy, I would watch things like Prince Valiant. I
Yes.
remember that being a cartoon when I was a little lad, and liking all the swords and shields. And
Yes.
I'd get the little soldier knight's outfit and imagine I was a knight. And going to the castle was very exciting for me. And then realizing, since becoming a parent, that between then and now, that heroic and, I suppose, in a way, romantic ideal is chiseled away at in many people. And I hadn't retouched that for many years. And when I, in the end, specialized in Chinese history, which is my specialty outside of this, I know it might
Yeah.
seem tangential and linear,
Yes.
but it made things very clear to me where we are. Because what I did is I looked through Chinese history and their 5,000 years of history, and realized in times where people started to forget their great buildings and their great uh, accomplishments and forgot about them or didn't appreciate them anymore, were surefire signs of societal decline. Surefire signs. So, for example, during the Warring States period, what we know as the Great Wall was in fact many, many different walls built during the Warring States period. We're talking about around 800 BC to around 400 BC. Many
Mhm.
states in China, as it disintegrated, built these separate Great Walls. Now, by the time they were unified by Qin Shi Huang in 221 BC, a lot of the walls were left to rot because they'd been they'd been there for so long. The states had unified, and many of them had outlived their purpose because those states no longer existed. Now,
Mhm.
what the unifier did, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor in 221 BC, was go, "Oh, we're going to join up these walls and we're going to use them." So he brought them with China into the future rather than neglecting them. And that's what made it very clear to me that when I look at our castles and the state of many of them, it's a surefire sign of an unfortunate neglect and decline. But yet at the same time, as soon as I saw the idea of Pendragon Foundation, the idea of restoring the castles, I remembered that heroic childhood image I had in my mind of castles, and remembered, no, these are places to be treasured and preserved, and held on as torches for the next generation. So that's how I came to it. In some ways, a linear way, but in other ways,
Mhm.
to me, it's almost very obvious that anyone studying history should, if they're studying it seriously, would come to these conclusions.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And even if they're not studying history, I think there's an innate sense in most people of the significance of our own ancestors. And I don't think actually I wouldn't have said that if maybe 10 years ago, but I think there seems to be more of a sense of it now, and an appreciation for the difficult lives that they led, physically difficult anyway, compared to ours. But and yet they managed to prosper and build flourishing civilizations. And there's certainly, maybe it is mostly online, but there is an awareness of that now. And I think even just most people have common sense, despite what you see on the internet. Most people, I think, do have common sense, and that common sense includes that wonder and that curiosity about your own past. But I would love to know, like, so do you think you will get to a point, with like a castle, like, is it Pevensey?
Mhm.
Pevensey?
Yes, Pevensey
Where,
Castle near Hastings. Yeah,
yes, where it could be transformed into a school, and you could even do things like jousting, because that would just be amazing.
absolutely. I mean, part of the vision is imagining a reclaiming, I suppose, of those romantic ideals, and physical training would be part of that. Part of that vision specifically was to use the outer part of the Bailey for perhaps farming, agriculture, physical training, jousting perhaps could be part of that, archery, those skills that we've lost that are obviously so necessary. Um,
Yeah,
and those ideals of both being physically fit and mentally healthy are things we need to bring with us into our future. Um, I think sometimes people can make the mistake of separating the two and thinking, well, one can just you know be a bookworm. But what we don't realise is some of us do, but what we don't realise is many of those medieval geniuses were also know, jousters, and they would not only be scribes and scholars, but also men of the sword, men of the shield as well. So yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. I'd love to see that happen.
Can you imagine the risk assessment form you'd have to fill out for the council to do jousting? Good luck. Um, no,
Well,
that's a really good point, actually, because over the summer I read Sebastian Morello's book about monasteries, mysticism and monasteries and something. I forget the other. I was completely enamored of this book. I don't know if you're familiar with it. I was just blown away by this book. I thought I was going to be a bit of a kind of a dry read. It was anything but. But that was one of his points, actually. And at the book ends with his training routine in the morning. Of course, he's coming at it from a perspective of a traditional Catholic, and his point is that the downfall really, or a turning point for the worse in the Catholic Church was when they abandoned the monasteries in favor of a clerisy, and in so doing, separated the mind and the body, and they left behind the monasteries, which were these communities based around rituals and being very grounded in one place. Physical rituals, farming, beekeeping, tending to the grounds, much like you would have in a castle, and that was inherently part of the spirituality aspect. And then he wrote about his own routine, which is not a mace. Maybe it was a mace. It's some sort of medieval weapon. It's very heavy with like a ball at the end, and he stands in the garden, kind of doing trying to lifting it over his head and stuff like that. And that's his fitness routine, which is simultaneously like super dorky and also incredibly like manly. I don't know how you pull that off, but no, it's true. I mean, I think we separate these things out in schools now, like, and it's mostly children sitting at a desk for many hours at a time, and boys suffer greatly from this, as has been widely noted, and a lot of sort of stuffy rooms and boring tasks and horrible lighting and terrible food, and this sounds like a lovely antidote to that.
yeah, I think yeah, I agree with you, Jenny. So much of it is uninspirational, isn't it? So much of it, the whole package. When you even from the outside, when you see a school, anything built since the 40s almost
So
is
ugly.
just is so drab.
Yeah.
It yeah, I think it's part of the whole package, and we at Pendragon think about these things, and in castles, in terms of their beauty, their history, their fullness of where they are, what the community seems to be calling for, what it needs. So, for example, with Pevensey, I think I've mentioned this, but there's already a precedent just 10 minutes up the road of Hurstman Zoo
Hmm.
being a university. So it's not like we haven't got these models already in modern times. It's just that we don't seem to be putting them into action, and we don't seem to be moving beyond a tourist model, which is so obviously slowly fading away and has served its
Yeah.
purpose, perhaps.
Yeah.
And I'd like to think that people like us, like me and you, Jenny, and perhaps some of our listeners, are inspired
Nerds.
by yeah,
Nerds.
yeah. Pardon?
Nerds.
Nerds. Yeah, yeah. Indeed,
Nerds.
indeed. I think many of us are, in some ways, are, and
Mhm.
but also we're inspired by these deeper things. At least we like to think we are, and we try. At least we try to be. And I don't think that's something that's driving many of our custodians. On some visits I've made, I remember going, for example, to Battle Abbey about 5 years ago on the anniversary of the Norman Conquest. There was a little sort of anniversary event there. It was during a half term, I think. I remember going out there enthusiastically thinking, oh, this is going to be good. I hadn't been to an English heritage site since I was a child, very long time. And it's my first time with kids. And the presentation was just so dull and lame.
Oh,
Uh,
really?
they did a little show. They sat around a little courtyard and said, "Welcome everyone to England," and made all these sort of undercutting, subversive jokes about the Battle of Hastings, and it was all kind of all very tongue in cheek.
Hmm.
It's kind of like we've seen all of this before, haven't we? For the
Right.
past 20 years, we've seen everyone mocking our history and mocking. At this point, one rolls one's eyes and just thinks, "Crikey, we could do a lot better than this. We really
Yeah.
could." And there were also a little marquee with it was advertised as your little ones can play as soldiers, but it was just some people standing around with plastic swords, and then it was just so uninspirational, so low energy that it
Hmm.
made me think we can do better than this. And I suppose that's one of the reasons why I'm here.
Yeah. Yeah. So how would you do it?
Well, we've started this Pendragon Foundation, and at its basis is the idea of voluntary contributions from everyone, from anyone and all of our different skill sets. For example, me personally, I've come into it with the background of my channel in YouTube, so I've got some skills in editing, and some skills in I'd like to think I have anyway in interviewing and talking about these things. But we also need people to build eventually. We need people to fundraise, to do accounting, finances. We need people of all sorts of skill sets. So it's all hands on board at the moment. And since we've started only back in August, the signs have been very encouraging so far. We already have people enthused by this vision and stepping forward to volunteer their services. And to me, that's just really, really encouraging and inspirational, because we
Yeah.
know how hard times are in many ways. And with people
Hmm.
coming forward during these times with such brilliant skill sets, it really is an encouraging thing. So I suppose at the moment it's building up our voluntary service, and anyone wants to know more about how they could get involved, go to Pendragon Foundation, and we'll see, you know, how we can work together to bring
Yeah.
these into the reality. Because of course, the ideal in the end is to get our own castles and bring these visions into reality.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, a few years ago, well, it's actually still an ongoing story, but um, Steve Bannon, the American MAGA leader, I suppose, he had a similar idea to start I think it was called the Center for the Judeo-Christian West, and he and his one of his colleagues, Ben Harnwell, who's English, rented a monastery just in the mountains south of Rome, and they had plans to develop this into a center of learning and community. It ran afoul of politics, unfortunately, and so it's been delayed hugely. The Ministry of Culture in Italy, because of the association with Bannon, meaning Trump, they kind of put the kibosh on it, and so it's still up in the air. But I remember reading about this in maybe like 2020, right around this. I got red pilled, as they say, and that was it was around 2020 that happened. And I thought, what a great idea. I went to university in the 90s, and I went to one of the oldest universities in on these isles, as you say. I went to Trinity in Dublin, which is slightly younger than Oxford and Cambridge. Um, so beautiful old buildings and very much a sense of history. But because it was the 90s, it was sort of the vibe, as the kids say, was very anti-canon. Not, I mean, not thoroughly, not nearly as bad as it would be today. But I went to study English, and the English department was very postmodern already at that point. And it literally killed all of the joy I had had up until going to university, in literature and reading and stuff, and I absolutely hated it. So it was not good. It was not a good experience overall, and part of that was because they spoiled all the fun. They spoiled all the fun by detaching from that sort of organic, um, I would say human, and even maybe sort of flamboyant and fun aspect of how of understanding the lives of the people that came thousands, hundreds, if not thousands of years before you, and through literature, you then realize how similar, the similarities, and you kind of feel like you're traveling through time. Anyway, my point being that that experience of being alienated from the canon via postmodernist universities was extremely demoralizing to me. I think it had a big impact on my life. And so when I hear about projects that aim to kind of counteract that and offer a more celebratory, and it doesn't have to be obviously not fake or hagiographic, but just an honest celebratory appreciation for the wonderful things that people did in the past. I just think what a wonderful idea, and I hope that it works, because I would love young people to be able to experience that. And it doesn't need to be an overly academic thing either. If you're talking about farming and you're talking about sporting activities like jousting, it's not something that you have to be like, getting A's in your A levels and, coming from Eton to be able to participate in. And this is just like the most important thing, I think. Well, maybe not the most important thing, but one of the major things that could counteract this malaise that we all are experiencing right now.
Absolutely, Jenny. Yeah, a lot of what you're saying rings true to me in my experience. I recall also doing an English bachelor's.
There you go.
After that, I specialised in Chinese history, and having the a Lord of the Rings completely subverted in front of my eyes.
No, really?
An opening lecturer saying, "Oh, and this whole story takes place inside a hobbit hole," and they were making all sorts of very, very cliched innuendo jokes about. It's just disgusting at this point, isn't it? At that kind of thing,
Yeah.
one almost rolls one's eyes and just clocks onto it now whenever one hears it. But yeah, a lot of what you're saying rings true to me. And part of the vision of Pendragon that appealed to me was, like you were saying, anyone can get involved. Anyone with those any skill set they have, from the bookish person who might want to write scripts for videos we do, to people who would want to get involved with their hands and actually build these castles eventually. Tradesmen, sports people, anyone with skills involved in handicraft to restore these castles to their former glory, people involved in tapestry, all sorts of things. Anyone can get on board with their skill set that they have. And that's one of the things that appealed to me. I thought, yeah, this will bring a lot of people together who I want to work with.
Yes, that's always a good reason to do something,
Mm.
actually.
It's going to appeal to people like me.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, in one way it is niche, but I don't know. I mean, I think England is fairly full of people like you in a way. Like it's a very English trait to sort of like find one particular thing and then just really like get really really into it. I know it's not just English, but I'm thinking of like train spotters or something. Not to compare you to a train spotter at all, but there's an appreciation for the this is the other thing that we've completely lost in the modern age. We're so inundated with stuff and comfort, and we have no concept of what it's like to live in the cold and have to build something from nothing. That we've really and also young people, of course, have been literally brainwashed into thinking that everything in the past was bad. But the incredible things that they were able to build. I came across a Substack yesterday. Oh my god! I'm actually going to look it up because it was this man sent me a note on Substack because he had read something I'd written and he thought I would like this essay he wrote about building in London in the 17th to 18th centuries. And I mean, it was far too detailed for me. It was very lengthy, but it was like going into all the different various bridges and buildings and and then he went into all the tools that would have been required to make these buildings and like how they would have been able to lift very heavy stones and chisels and all this really detailed stuff that really went over my head. But it was such a good representation of what went into making the physical world around us that we now don't even see anymore. We don't even see it anymore. I imagine if you live in London, you would just be like, you're just rushing from A to B every day and you no longer even see the magnificence that's all around you. I mean, that's just what happens, right? That happens everywhere. But we've lost that appreciation. Okay, now I'm not being able to find his name. We've lost that appreciation for the artistry or the craftsmanship and the sheer brute force it took to build society back then.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question? Do you think it was more of a whole society effort back then?
Oh, absolutely. This was an intergenerational accomplishment. Some of these medieval cathedrals and castles, some of them, they would have bricklayers whose grandfather were working on them. And it would be the
Yeah.
same family from 3 generations to completion. I can't name a single building, perhaps with some exceptions. Perhaps the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona would be an exception to the rule of this, the great Gaudi Cathedral being
Mm-hmm.
built in Barcelona. Other than that, we want to see things click our fingers and have it done in our lifetime. This is the kind of vision that will not survive the test of time. We must start thinking in these intergenerational terms. I know that perhaps I might not be the one to see these castles
Mm-hmm.
rebuilt. Realistically, I'd hope so. The optimist in
Well,
me
some, yeah.
says yes, but maybe I won't be. But that's not what I'm in it for. I'm not in it to see it right now, although that would be the ideal. I'm in it to see it 3 or 4 generations down the line,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that would be a great place to stop, really, because it's a note of optimism. Um, but also, I appreciate that acknowledgement that we are leaving something to future generations. That's another thing that we've lost sight of. Certainly, the political class has. They're borrowing, they're robbing Peter to pay Paul. They're borrowing against their own children and grandchildren's. livelihoods and well-being to pay for themselves now, which is just an absolute abomination. And it's against the order of nature. Um, so yeah, I really wish you guys a ton of success. Are there any? Are you planning any events or anything like that?
I think recently we had a magazine that we did and a calendar, and I think there's one on the cards for springtime. So I know people can put their submissions and sketchworks in for that, and perhaps an event further down the line as well. I know ideas have been discussed with regards to having a grand event at a well-known hall, but we'll see how that goes. But yeah, if anyone wants to know more about what I'm speaking of, Pendragon Foundation is the place to go for the most recent updates. So yeah, hopefully in the future, Jenny. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, why don't we check in with you again in a year's time or so, and hopefully you'll have progressed on that jousting competition.
Sounds grand. Can we
Well,
get
thank
you
you
in the
so much.
jousting, Jenny?
Definitely not. You know what I'll do? I'll sit up on those risers with a lovely hat and a veil like Maid Marian, and I'll
And throw
clap.
down a handkerchief.
Yes,
Lovely.
I'll throw down a handkerchief and live out my Maid Marian dreams. But I am not
Sounds
getting on a
grand.
horse. I am not getting on a horse. I've tried that. It did not go well. Right. Well, yeah, it's lovely to talk to you. And so say the name of the website again.
Pendragon Foundation, and I think we're on Twitter as well. Pendragon.org, I think it's called. You can
Oops.
find us on there.
That's my son calling, so I'm going to go. Thank you so much, James.
Thank
Talk
you,
to you
Jenny.
soon.
Nice to meet you. Thanks for having me.
Nice to meet you.